Hello, Vandana. Cancun has just passed, and it was an incredible success. At least many commentators say this, of the movements, of the social movements of the poor countries, and finally a new agenda may come out of it. What, in your opinion, comes next?
Well, new agenda will only come out to the extent that movements and governments start taking steps to build alternatives, whether it is alternative rules of trade or alternative institutional systems, alternative decision-making systems that lend themselves to democracy. We can already see that the powerful countries, Europe and US, are trying to undo the victories of Cancun. They're preventing the G22 and the other southern governments from starting to negotiate on the parameters which created the cracks of Cancun and led to the victory. They are trying to bring back the pre-Cancun dictatorship. And I think what we need to do is strong voices of people around the world working in partnerships with willing governments, because some governments are already too deeply committed to globalization. Some realize that you cannot sacrifice your people to a bunch of rules created for corporate expansion and corporate power. And I think we need to start creating alternative rules and working on them. It is time now to do what Gandhi did with trade in another period of imperialism, where he started to say, sorry, we're not going to live by these rules, we'll make our own. We will boycott your textiles, we will make our own. It is time to start boycotting seeds of Monsanto, grain traded by Cargill, textiles made by corporations that super exploit labor in the third world. It's time to start building alternative economies on our terms, and we don't need to wait till WTO reforms itself for doing that. We need to build those institutions on the ground now, and where they already exist, we need to put them into a huge new global partnership. That is how changes always come, where small initiatives taken by civil society end up creating the norm for new forms of governance. New forms of governance do not emerge from old forms of governance. They emerge from resistance to old forms of governance and creation of alternatives. In food, we are making huge progress on this. We have a global commission on the future of food. I think we need to do it for every sector, how our clothes are made, how our information is transmitted, what happens to our drugs. I'm going to take steps to find 5 African countries who can start importing Indian medicine. Why do we need to kneel in front of a WTO, a corrupt institution, and seek permission where the victims dying of AIDS can, after 3, 4, 6 months of permission from this agency, and them seeking permission from the global pharmaceutical industry, provide drugs that we have a right to make and Africans have a right to buy from us directly? Why should we have to go through the permissions of dictatorships?
So, which governments and how should we address the issue now as people? I mean, what can citizens do?
I think the peace meeting in Perugia is such a good example. I don't think Italy has the proudest leadership at this point in terms of peace at the national level. After all, Italy at the national level, at the governmental level, supported the Iraq war. But at the subnational level, even governments are supporting peace. The march from Perugia to Assisi is a proof of that commitment. And I think what we need to do is recognize that government is not just national. Government is a multi-layered system. It's many, many facets. And we need to find the partners in any level and in any facet that's willing to work with civil society at this point and move the system doing that.
Just one last question. So, WTO, the old corrupted institution, which is not that old actually, now, is it reformable or should we start all over again?
Well, I think that debate is a bit dated. In 1999, one could have had a theoretical debate, is it reformable or is it not? Reforms were tried in Seattle, reforms were blocked by the WTO and the powerful countries. The reform process was blocked again in Doha, and under the shadow of 9/11, using the issue of terrorism, a trade agenda was pushed through under the garb of a development agenda when it had nothing to do with development. The reform agenda was brought very, very clearly by movements, by governments. African countries laid a very clear agenda about cotton subsidies. As simple as that. If the agriculture agreement had to reform, you couldn't have a more accurately worked out system of distortion that is creating poverty in already poor countries for already poor farmers. And yet there was a clear commitment on the part of the United States, whose agribusiness is gaining from these subsidies. I see these subsidies as US public subsidies paid to agribusiness, not to US farmers. The WTO showed itself to not be willing to reform. The failure of Cancun was a proof of the unwillingness and inability of the WTO and the rich countries to reform. So I really feel we need to be looking at the empirical data now and not on theoretical debates.
Thank you very much.